It's my distinguished pleasure to introduce yet another incredible speaker. Our next speaker is Professor Cline, the gentleman on my right, or your left. A couple of things I could say to introduce him. I wish I could say more. But he received his PhD, or his master's from Yale, and then his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. He is currently Professor of Classics and Anthropology at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He has managed to achieve three incredible distinctions. The first is he has managed to conduct 30 consecutive years of field work. So he's a seasoned archaeologist who excavated in Megiddo, which is biblical Armageddon, as well as Telcubri. He somehow, while excavating for 30 years, has found time to write 16 books and more than 100 journal articles. He has also found time to become a very good teacher, and being a good teacher takes a lot of work as well in terms of preparation. He has won, I found him because I was browsing through the Archaeological Institute of America's Teaching Awards, the annual award given, and his name came up. I thought, oh, I must be a good teacher, this is perfect. And then everything else started clicking and clicking and clicking. But he also won the Trachtenberg Prize for Teaching Excellence, as well as the Trachtenberg Prize for Faculty Scholarship. So research and teaching, the only faculty member at GW to do both. He has also recently produced a course, The Teaching Company, which you can check out if you're interested. And he has a book that came out recently on the topic of today, which is the Late Bronze Age Collapse, title 1177 BC, which we'll be talking about today. And you have a forthcoming book, which is a delightful, I haven't read it, but I assume it will be based upon my conversations with him, a delightful sort of summary of the field of archaeology in terms of its historical development and major findings. Which is sort of intended to be a sequel to a previous classic in the field. So please join me in welcoming Professor Cline.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. You all having a good time so far?
Yes.
Previous speakers have been great, so I have a lot to live up to. Yeah, well, Dr. Harl is absolutely amazing, so I'm in trepidation following in his footsteps, but we'll see how I do. Anyway, it's wonderful to be here. It's nice to be back at Yale. I got my master's here in 1984, and near as I could figure, I haven't been back since. I was wandering around last night going, wow, this has changed. Really changed, but the Hall of Graduate Studies is still there, so I felt good. Anyway, we're going to talk here about the Late Bronze Age and the collapse of the cities. I'll introduce them to begin with and then destroy them. But I presume this is familiar to many of you. How many of you teach some aspect of this in your classes? Right, okay, so Mycenae, Knossos, all that stuff. Right, good. So we've got a knowledgeable audience here. So you also won't mind if I go for 3 or 4 hours? This is fine? All right, just stop me when you've had enough. All right. So we're going to be concentrating here on the Late Bronze Age from about 1700 until 1200 BC. This is my absolute favorite period of ancient history. If I could be reincarnated backwards, I would want to be in this particular period. I'm sure I would not survive for about 24 to 48 hours, but it would be a lot of fun while I was there. Now, you see some of the great powers at the time on this map. I say that they are the G8 of the Late Bronze Age. There's actually 9 there, but who's counting? So we've got over here in Greece, we've got the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. We've got the Hittites up here in Turkey. We've got Mitanni in red. We've got Assyria and Babylonia over here. Cypriots are on Cyprus. And then in orange there, we've got the Egyptians coming up the Nile Valley and into what was then Canaan. So this is what we're going to be focusing in on, and in particular we'll zoom in on 1200 BC and what happened just after that. Now, those of you that are not familiar with this period, you actually know more about it than you think already, right? Hatshepsut, how many have heard of her, the famous female pharaoh? Okay, Tutmosis III, one of the best conquerors Egypt ever had. My favorite guy, Amenhotep III, I wrote my master's thesis on him. His son, Akhenaten, the famous heretic pharaoh. King Tut, I presume most everybody here, if you don't know him, you've been living in a closet somewhere, right? Ramses II, perhaps the pharaoh of the Exodus, and then the guy that we're going to concentrate on, Ramses III, who fights the Sea Peoples. This is also the time period, though, of the Battle of Kadesh in about 1279. Trojan War, if it took place, is going to be at this time period, somewhere between 1250 and 1175. And also the Exodus, if it took place, is going going to be at about this time as well, probably about 1250 BC. So lots going on in the late Bronze Age. In fact, it is I hesitate to call it this, but I will, a globalized world system. It's not globalized like we know today, but for that particular period, it is globalized. If you talk about something from Italy on one side to Afghanistan on the other, Turkey down to Egypt, that in that area is a globalized world system such as you see here. This is a social network diagram that my wife made. She does social network analysis. If you're familiar with the cocktail party game, the 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, right, with who's in what movie, you can do the same thing here. And that is, if the Egyptians didn't know the Hittites, they knew somebody who knew them. So nobody is more than 2 or 3 steps away from anybody else. So it is very much a small world, and that's what you need to be a globalized world system back then. So, for instance, we've got in Greece, we've got Mycenae and the Mycenaeans, Agamemnon. Here's the capital city, the type site after which the Mycenaeans are named, with the fortification wall going around. We've got a map right there. There's Mycenae there in connection to Athens, just to place you. There it is on a nice little mountaintop, not the highest mountaintop in the area, but enough that you can see for about 10 kilometers in all directions. You come in here through the entrance gate. There's the famous Shaftgrave Circle, which I'll show you in a minute, and you make your way up to the palace. So they're around from about 1700 to 1200 BC. There's the famous Lion Gate, one of the oldest freestanding sculptures in Europe. Now it's been reconstructed like this. You know, the heads are not there. So archaeologists have fun playing with putting different heads on them from time to time, including aliens most recently, but never mind. This is a very typical site. You walk up, you've got the big Cyclopean masonry on your left. You've got a tower on your right. And Dr. Hall was talking about how the hoplites are outfitted. Same sort of thing back here in the late Bronze Age. You're going to have your shield on your left hand, and then your sword in your right hand. How many people are left-handed here? Yeah, sorry, back then you're right-handed. No choice. All right, so you've got shield on your left, spear, sword in your right. As you're coming up towards the Lion Gate here, you are going to be protected on your left side because of your shield, but as you get right up to the entrance, that tower, you see it ruined there, you're going to be attacked from your right, you're going to be dead before you ever get through the gate. Very standard for Mycenaean palaces. They all have this system. And keep your eye on this right there. It is a slip zone. This is actually an active seismic area. So that is actually 1/2 of an earthquake fault zone. And the archaeologists never knew that. When the seismologists showed up, they started laughing. And they're like, what are you laughing at? This is a very serious city. They're like, they built it right on top of an earthquake fault zone. And then they went, why would anybody do that? And then somebody said, I'm from San Francisco. I think we did that too. Right? So we'll come back to that. Keep your eye on that. All right? Okay, so we have the shaft graves inside. Which would have looked like this. This is from the earliest period of the city, back in about 1600 BC, where we've got the famous gold masks. If anybody is in the area of Washington, D.C., go to National Geographic. They've got the Greeks exhibit up right now. It's absolutely amazing. 500 objects, some of which have never left Greece before. They've got this one, but it's a facsimile. They have one of the other ones, which is real, but it's absolutely amazing. And there was just a 3-week series on PBS, if you saw it, The Greeks. The last one was just now on Tuesday. So, absolutely amazing exhibit in Washington, D.C. My favorite piece, the inlaid dagger, the lion hunt. But again, this is from the earliest period of Mycenae. If we march up to the top, we get up to the palace, which is going to be there right up through and functioning until 1200 BC. Outer porch, inner waiting room, and then the back room with the king back there. Hard to tell what it would have looked like from the foundations here, but if I tell you that it was completely painted, would that help at all? Try reimagining what it might have looked like. You're going to have the walls going up, they're plastered, and then painted, okay? But I guarantee that no matter what you've imagined, it's nowhere close to reality. That's reality. It also, I think, qualifies as garish is the word that comes to mind. That's what it would have looked like. All the pieces, none of them were in place. They were all found broken up and lying in the ground, but this is pretty much what it would have looked like. As you walk in, there's a hearth in between you and the king's palace. So think kind of a Wizard of Oz effect. So you can hear this voice from the back, but you can't really see the king.
Got lit up?
Probably be lit up, but it'd still be dark. It'd be smoky. There's no windows. The only way anything can get out is through your light well up top. So it'd be very dark and smoky and dank in there, I think. In comparison, the Minoans on Crete are very different, and we've got the capital city, or one of the capital, let's just call it a capital, of Knossos there. There's about 7 different palaces on Crete at this time, all owned by the Minoans. None of them with walls around them, which has always caused a problem. Why wouldn't you have walls around it? So the thinking now is that maybe the head honcho, Minos, if you will, is at Knossos, and other members of the family are at the other palaces, and that's why they're not protected, because they're not going to attack each other. But this is the opposite of a Mycenaean palace. This is open, it's light, it's airy, lots of light. It is integrated into the landscape. These people are at one with the countryside, and they have a love of plants and animals also. So I usually teach about a real dichotomy between the Mycenaeans and the Minoans, with the Mycenaeans being very warlike and the Minoans being a lot more peaceful, but that may be us putting it back on them. They're also into strange things with bulls, right? The Minoan bull leapers. This is an actual very small wall painting showing them doing something with bulls. The women are always white or yellow. The men are always red or brown. So we've got 2 women and 1 man, and either they are all flipping, and you see this in sequence with her just having landed, him flipping, and her about to jump over, or they're more like the role of rodeo clowns, and they're distracting the bull while he leaps over it. You can't really tell. But this whole idea of leaping over a bull, imagine like you're in the Olympics and you're doing the pommel horse, except the pommel horse has horns and is trying to kill you. All right? That's kind of what's going on right now. And in fact, if you type in bull leaping into the internet and look at YouTube, there are people in Spain that are doing this today as part of entertainment. So they're quite good. They flip in midair. So we've got the Minoans, we've got the Mycenaeans. We also have the Trojans, the Trojan horse. This is not the original. This is the facsimile that was made and put up at Troy. Courtesy of Homer, of course, we know of Troy and the Trojan War with the Illiad and the Odyssey. You're all familiar with the tale, so I won't go into it, but just be aware that the ancient Greeks didn't know when this had happened. They have 13 different dates they had suggested. Finally, they settled on 1184 BC, which I think is actually pretty close. It's probably somewhere between, I said earlier, 1250 to 1175. I'd probably narrow it down to 1200 to 1175, somewhere in there. Heinrich Schliemann found Troy. That's actually how I got interested in archaeology and ancient history to begin with. My mother gave me a book when I was 7 years old called The Walls of Windy Troy. It's a biography by Marjorie Bramer. And then when I graduated from college with a degree in archaeology, my mother gave me the same book again. So, yeah, very sweet. And in fact, I still have it. It's in my office. So, and now I teach a seminar to freshmen on Troy and the Trojan War. So it comes full circle, right? So, anyway, here's Troy 6, which is probably the Troy of the Trojan War. It could be Troy 7, but you see the massive walls right here. I should mention, though, that of course not everybody thinks that the Trojan War happened. My wife, in fact, does not think it happened, so we have arguments at home over this. This is what happens when 2 archaeologists marry each other. You argue about the Trojan War. At the same time, all right, so here's Troy over here on the northwestern coast. We've also got over here Boazkoi or Hattusas, the capital city of the Hittites. They're interacting with everybody as well. You can see here the mountain pass. That's the only way to get into Hattusas. We're about an hour-and-a-half drive east of Ankara at this point, so it's the central Anatolian plateau. That's the only way in. They are also around from about 1700 to 1200 BC, same as the Minoans, Mycenaeans. Their city's only captured twice in their entire history because it was so well protected. All right, so here it is. There's the plan on a photograph, and you can see even if you make it in, then you've got to go up against their fortifications. And it gets awfully cold and snowy in the winter there, and they don't have things like olives, so they have to trade for olive oil. They have their own lion gate, which looks a little different from the Mycenaean one. These look more like seals to me than lions. Right, but the famous seal gate doesn't quite work. We don't know which way the influences go. The Hittites and the Mycenaeans are definitely influencing each other, but we don't know which way the influences are going. And then we've got the site of Ugarit on the north coast of Syria. I'm not actually sure if it exists anymore, since it's in the middle of a Syrian civil war and other things. But the French excavated it from about the 1920s on. You can see the town right here. It turns out to be a very important international trading center during the late Bronze Age. And it's particularly important for us because there have been a number of archives found. So we've actually got the written texts. And there is now a whole cottage industry of Ugaritic studies. Because in these tablets, they've got historical records, they've got letters between kings, letters from vassals, they've also got myths, epics, love poems, you name it, they've got everything written. The only thing is you have to be able to read Ugaritic, which I can't, but others can. So this gives us an insight because in among these texts, they talk about things going along merrily right up until the end when that just collapses. So everything seems to be okay. It's not a gradual decline. It's very, very, very sudden. So what we've got, the hallmark of this whole period, we're in the Bronze Age. In fact, the Bronze Age as a whole goes from 3000 BC to 1000 BC. We're in the late Bronze Age, which, as I said, is 1700 to 1200 BC. The way you make bronze, as I've got up here on the slide, is tin plus copper. 90% copper, 10% tin. You do those, you've got yourself bronze. If you don't have tin, you can use arsenic. I don't recommend it. You're not going to live very long, but you could use arsenic if you need to. Now, the copper is not a problem. Copper's coming from Cyprus. In fact, that's where the name comes from. Kypros means copper. The tin is another bit of a problem, though. There's a little bit of tin down here in Turkey. There's also tin in Cornwall, and they may have been going from time to time to get it there, but the vast majority of the tin in the ancient world of that time is coming from off the map here in Afghanistan, specifically the Badakhshan region. In fact, it's not just tin that comes from there. Anybody here have any lapis lazuli jewelry? Okay, lapis also comes from that area, and they are trading for it. So this is some of the raw materials, and the tin is going to come all the way across from Afghanistan to the Aegean and perhaps beyond. So in fact, we have a letter from the site of Mari, which is right there on the Euphrates River in what is Syria today. It's a letter that dates to a little after 1800 BC, so almost just before the start of our period. And in this text, which I know is too small, you can't read it, so I'll read it to you. It says, 1 1/3 mina of tin to the Kaftorian. Now, Kaftor is their name for Crete. So 1 1/3 mina of tin to the Minoan from Crete. 1/3 of a mina of tin to the interpreter of the chief merchant of the Kaftorians in Ugarit. So this is a letter at Mari. It's talking about Ugarit, and it's talking about tin coming from Afghanistan. And there is a guy, apparently, who's an interpreter who is able to speak both Minoan and Akkadian and is translating for them. So we know that the tin is coming to Mari, then to Ugarit, and then over to Crete and onwards. So this is long-distance trade. Imagine if it's cut at any point. You're going to be in trouble for your tin. And if you're in trouble for your tin, you're in trouble for your bronze. And that seems to be part of what happens round about 1200 BC, is that these trade routes are probably cut. Now, in terms of how important tin was at the time, the best analogy I can make is what my friend Carol Bell did. She's an academic over in Britain. And she said tin to them was like oil to us today. And that getting tin concerned the Egyptian pharaoh and the Hittite king just as much as getting oil concerns the US president today. And I think that's probably the best analogy. So they are trading tin, they are trading lapis lazuli. They are also trading finished goods. And in these Mari letters, which again date to about 1800 BC, one letter, for example, says a Caphtorian weapon. So that's a Minoan weapon coming from Crete. The top and the base are covered with gold. Its top is encrusted with lapis lazuli. So it would have looked something like this. This isn't actually it. This is from the death pits of Ur, dating to about 2500 BC. But it must have looked similar with the gold and the lapis lazuli. Now, I don't know about you, but I want one of these. I just want one of these. But we've also got a text that talks about probably my favorite incident in ancient history. It says, one pair of leather shoes in the Caphtorian style. So, Minoan shoes. And if you've been to, how many people have been to Crete? All right, well, Crete, Minoan, it's sandals, basically. Hanya makes boots, but most everybody else makes leather sandals. So a pair of leather shoes in the Caphtorian style, which to the palace of Hammurabi, king of Babylon, and yes, that is the Hammurabi, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, Bhakti Lim, an official, carried, but which were returned. So somebody is sending Minoan sandals all the way to Babylon and giving them to Hammurabi, and he says thanks but no thanks and returns them. I've never understood that. So were they too last millennium? Were they too small? Now, you know, the Law Code of Hammurabi has got 272 laws in it, and I frequently teach my students at least the first couple of them in my intro class. But then one day for fun, I just said, here's an English translation, go through and tell me the penalty for returning shoes or sandals. And they came back kind of crestfallen, they said, there's no penalty, there's no law. I said, exactly, he got away with it. But still, I don't know, you got something coming all the way from Crete. Wouldn't you have said, here, these don't fit me, but they'll fit you? I mean, re-gifting? Doesn't work. Anyway, so the point is that they're sending around finished objects along with the raw materials, and I would argue, along with both of those sets of goods, also the ideas are coming. So they're coming along. So for instance, Epic of Gilgamesh, the Illiad, the Odyssey, they're all portions that are vaguely similar. Everybody goes down to the underworld, this, that, and the other. I think those stories are coming with the trade goods. And here the importance are the people that are manning the boats. Right? Dr. Hall just talked about how many people were in a trireme and all that. Well, you don't quite have that many on a late Bronze Age boat, but you still do have an entire crew. And when the officials are up at the palace doing the diplomatic negotiations and whatever they're doing, the crewmen are getting drunk in the bars and the inns waiting to go back home, and they're like, hey, I got a story for you, and I think they're swapping tales and they're swapping ideas. And so I think that's in part something that we've overlooked, the transmission of ideas at the lower levels of society, just the ordinary people who are there, you know, for some other reason, are then swapping these stories. So I think that's how we get things like the myth of Kumarbi from the Hittites looking a lot like Hesiod's works. I think that's how it's getting there. So I wouldn't discount the ordinary people. And we do know that there are such trade, embassies and other things, diplomatic. Here's Hatshepsut, for example. At her mortuary temple, we know that she sends an embassy to Punt. She's not the first to do so from Egypt, and she will not be the last, but she gives us the best representations of what is being brought back from Punt. She even tells us the queen of Punt, her name is Eti, so we know that they've got people going back and forth. Our major problem was we didn't know where Punt was until recently. Just a couple years ago, in the British Museum, they analyzed some baboon mummies and found out that they most closely resemble in the DNA and other things to Ethiopia and Eritrea, which actually was one of the suggestions. It was Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Yemen were the main candidates for Punt. So now we can say pretty much for sure, Ethiopia, Eritrea, that is where Punt is. So imagine the Egyptians sending trade down there. But they're also trading with people from the Aegean. This is the tomb of Rekhmire, vizier to Thutmosis III and Hatshepsut. And on the walls of his tomb, he's got Minoans painted bringing gifts. Actually, one of them is repainted, and they're thinking maybe this is when Mycenaeans take over from Minoans, but who knows? Aegean people, let's just put it that way. They're trading with the Aegean. Here's another one. That guy carrying a bull's head, he's definitely a Minoan, no two ways about it. So we've got the Egyptians sending out diplomatic embassies and trade missions all over the place at this time. Another one to the Aegean, my favorite, there's Colossi of Memnon. The mortuary temple of Amenhotep III, this is dating to about 1360 BC. The mortuary temple is completely gone. It was stolen by the other pharaohs to build their temples, right? Ready-made blocks. But if you go back there and into the weeds, they found at one point they had found 5 statue bases. It's now up to about 40 because of the renewed excavations there. Each of these statue bases, which is about 10 feet tall, would have been the statue, so slightly over life size. They have a list of names on the base that represent the world as known to the Egyptians in the late Bronze Age. This particular one lists names from Greece. It's never been seen before. It'll never be seen again. These two over here are Tanaya and Keftiu, which are the Egyptian names for mainland Greece. That's Tanaya. And Keftiu, it's like Kaftor. That's Crete. So you've got mainland Greece and Crete here, and then over on this side and around, you've got 14 other names. And these are names, like I said, that have never been seen before. Amnisos, Festos, Kydonia, Mycenae, Dicte, Katozacro, Methana, Naphthion, Kithra, Ilios, Knossos, and then Amnisos again. This looks to me like a geographical itinerary, and in fact, if you go to Greece, at most of the sites that are listed on that statue base, you actually have objects of Amenhotep III or his wife, Queen T, at those Aegean sites. So here's a faience plaque. There's about 11 of them at Mycenae with Amenhotep. Netra Nefer Namat Ra, that's Amenhotep III. These type of Egyptian plaques are not found anywhere else in the world outside of Egypt except Mycenae. There's something special that went on there. So I actually think that we've got, as I said, a geographical itinerary where they're going up to Crete and visiting the Minoans, who they've known for quite a while. Then they continue on to the Mycenaeans, who at this point are kind of upstarts in the 14th century. Then they come back down to Crete and then back to Egypt. And I think that's why Amnisos is on there twice. So the first place you get to when you're coming up from Crete, you're like, oh, thank God, everybody out and use the bathroom. I'm going to get a coffee, rest stop, right? Then you go around the Aegean, and then you come back, and you're like, okay, we're back at Amnisos. Last stop, everybody empty your bladder, get your coffee. Now we're headed for Egypt, right? So it's a round trip is what I think. Now, I don't think Amenhotep III himself went. I think this is some sort of diplomatic or trade embassy that is going there. And in fact, we have very good evidence that such things were going on. This is the Uluburun ship that sank off the coast of Turkey in about 1300 BC, so a little after the time of Amenhotep III. This is from National Geographic, and what you see up top is an Egyptian tomb painting, much like we had at Rekhmare's tomb. And then the bottom is the reconstruction of what the ship would have looked like. So it goes down at about 1300 BC, was found in 1982. They did something like 20,000 dives in a dozen years there and took pictures of everything. Most of the cargo is copper ingots, like raw copper from Cyprus. Each of them weighing about 60 pounds. There are more than 300 ingots on this shipwreck. Then there's also these blocks of stone with a hole in each one. Anybody know what those are? They're running the length of the keel, so they're being used as ballast for most of the time. But then they're actually stone anchors. Yeah. So as your anchor gets stuck, you're like, and you cut the rope, and then you pull up another one. In the meantime, they're being used as ballast. We have these type of stone anchors at sites in Cyprus, for example, but we've never actually found them before in situ, in an ancient ship. So as I said, there's more than 300 of these oxide ingots, as we call them. They look like if you slaughtered an ox and chopped off the head and then you just had the legs. It's in 4, and you can actually carry these quite easily. Those 300 ingots make about 10 tons of copper. There's also a ton of tin on the wreck. So if you put those together, you've got yourselves 11 tons of bronze. So when this ship went down, somebody lost a fortune. And I actually suspect that somebody must have lost a kingdom or a war also. Because this amount of copper and tin, as George Bass, the guy that was excavating this, once said, you could outfit an army of 300 people with swords, shields, helmets, even greaves, the whole shebang. So this is enough to outfit 300 men. So there's part of the tin. There's a tin ingot right there, another, so there's a ton. We've also got terebinth resin on board, which is from the pistachio tree. You use this in making perfume. There's a ton of that on board. Ivory. The tusk is from an elephant. The other two, the incisor and canine, are from hippo. And this actually made everybody go back to the museums, because we had just thought all the ivory was from elephant. Turns out about 90% of the Bronze Age is from hippo. And they're like, but there aren't any hippos in Israel, Lebanon, Syria now. They're like, yep. Now you know why. Exactly. Right, so lots of raw ivory there. Some of my favorites up here, also ingots of raw material. Anybody hazard a guess what material we're looking at there?
Is that lapis?
It's not lapis, but it's a replacement for it. It's glass.
Oh.
It's raw glass. In this case, they're colored with cobalt, so they're blue.
That's why I thought it was lapis.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why glass is invented, in part, to replace expensive stone like lapis lazuli. But in addition to the blue, we've also got pink ones, yellow ones, brown ones. We've got all kinds. They've got about 150 of these, I think, maybe a little bit less on board. And then down here, finished cargo. This is actually from Cyprus and Syro-Palestine, and they were found in a huge jar, which originally they thought would have held fresh water and been up on the deck. Turns out it was a china barrel. When they tipped it over trying to pick it up, all this spilled out. So you've got raw materials and finished goods, and it looks like this ship is heading towards Greece, because the one thing you don't have in any of this are brand new stuff from the Minoans or Mycenaeans. You do have some used pottery, which looks like it belongs to the crew, but you don't have finished goods. So it looks like this is all stuff from the Near East being sent to Greece. On the return home, or just the return trip, you would have probably packed full Minoan and Mycenaean stuff, taking it to Egypt and the Near East. But this is going to Greece at this point. So this is the route. They thought it went round and round and round and round. I'm not so sure about that. I actually think this might be a ship sent from one king to another as a royal gift, because there's a couple of objects on there that are only used by kings, these drinking vessels called bibru. So I'm not sure I agree with George Bass, and I might suggest an alternative that it's straight one way or the other. But we also suggested, my co-director at Cabri and I, we published an article in about 2007 suggesting that the Uluburun ship was actually on a shopping trip. And it was from Greece to the Near East, because all the raw materials match things that have workshops at places like Pylos and Mycenae. So somebody could say, look, we're pretty much out of tin, we're out of copper, we're out of glass, we need some of that terebinth resin stuff, so could somebody go to the Near East and get it, and while you're out, get some milk and sugar too, right? But on the way back, it sank. So, and it's definitely possible because we've got sets of weights from both sides. So I put that out there as a possibility. And we've also got textual evidence from just a little bit later. This is from Ugarit, one of the merchants in North Syria, a guy named Sinaranu. And it says in the text, from the present day, Amastamru, son of Nikmepa, king of Ugarit, exempts Sinaranu, son of Siginu. I really wanted to name my son this, but my wife objected. I don't know why. I'm like, he'll be the only Sinaranu in the classroom. Like, no. So this guy, Sinaranu, is the merchant. His grain, his beer, his olive oil to the palace he shall not deliver. His ship is exempt when it arrives from Crete. So you've got a guy in North Syria sending, a private merchant sending a ship to Crete, bringing back grain, olive oil, and beer. And when he gets back, he doesn't have to pay taxes on it. So I think this is actually the first corporate tax exemption in history that we've got. Right, so it shows how interconnected that everybody is at this time. Okay, so everybody is merrily going along like this, from It takes a little while to get started, but by say 1500 this is going on. So 1500, 1400, 1300, diplomacy, reciprocity, trade, everybody is happily interacting with absolutely everybody else. Round about 1200 BC, there's a little chaos interjected here, and one by one, each of the civilization winks out until you're left just with Egypt. It's the only one really left standing, and even they are so weakened that this is a Pyrrhic victory, right? They'll never be as great as they were back in the New Kingdom period, the time of King Tut and all that. Yes, exactly, right. So Egypt always is under somebody else's thumb. So this is what's happened. There is a collapse. Round about 1200 BC, I actually think it takes place a little bit later. It's actually a continuous, it's like a systems collapse, which we will get to. But basically, everybody and everything we just talked about goes away. That's it. So it is a huge collapse. It is ginormous, as my kids would say. I would say that the world doesn't see such an enormous collapse again until the Romans fall. Right? And that's going to be 1500 years later. So the big question is, what caused this? What could bring everything to a screeching halt all at the same time? What could cause these cities like Mycenae, Knossos, Hattusas, Ugarit to all simply end? And if they ended that suddenly, could it happen to us? And that's why I think that studying this particular period, which is 3,200 years ago, is not as irrelevant as some people might think. I think it does hold some lessons perhaps for us. Without pushing it a little bit too much, if we can see what led to their collapse and then see if we've got anything around today, we might go, maybe we should try avoiding that kind of stuff. So the problem is we don't actually know what happens. It always used to be blamed on the sea peoples. And they come through, according to the Egyptians, they come through twice. They come through in 1207, and they come through in 1177. Right, and that's where the title of my book comes from, is 1177 for the second wave. Now, even that is not quite accurate because, the Egyptologists keep changing the chronology. So it's actually more accurate to say they come through in the 5th year of Merneptah and the 8th year of Ramses III. All right, so we know about them from the wall relief that Ramses III leaves us at Medinet Habu. This was found a very long time ago, so Gaston Maspero, a French Egyptologist, already by the 1860s had said, look, the sea peoples must be responsible for the collapse. And by about 1901, that was the theory. So whenever anybody went and excavated a site that was destroyed at about this time, they said, it must be the sea peoples. But that's kind of working backwards. That's finding a theory and then fitting your facts to it. And so the sea peoples now, in kind of revisionist history, are no longer, at least according to me, responsible for as much destruction as we thought. I do think that they're there, but I think in some cases they're as much victims as they were oppressors. All right, and I'll show you that in just a moment. But first, as a sample, Ramses III in year 8 tells us the foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. From Kate, Kode, Carchemish, Artsua, and Alasia on. Now, we know where those are, right? Hate, those are the Hittites up in Turkey. Kode is where Turkey meets Syria. Carchemish is in the same area. Artsua, though, is back on the western coast of Turkey over by Troy. Alasia is the ancient name for Cyprus. But basically, we can see that they're sweeping from west to east. They're coming across Greece and Turkey and Cyprus. And then a camp was set up in one place in Amur. That's by Ugarit in North Syria. And then they come down to Egypt. They were coming forward. All the flame was prepared before them. And then he tells us who they are. He doesn't actually call them the sea peoples. That's our name for them. He actually tells us the individual groups. Peleset, Tejeker, Shekelesh, Denyen, and Weshesh, lands united. So he actually names them. And in fact, Merneptah, 30 years earlier, had named a slightly different group. So all told, there's about 9 groups that come on in. But Ramses tells us that he defeated them. The sea peoples lose both times. I overthrew those who invaded from their lands. I slew the Denyen who were in their isles. The Tejeker and the Peleset were made ashes. Shardana and the Weshus of the sea, they were made as those that exist not, and so on. So in the end, like I say, Egypt won, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. On the way, everybody else lost. So one of our big questions is, who exactly are these people? Well, Ramses shows us them. These are pictures of the sea peoples, and so, for instance, if you want to go dressed up as a sea person for Halloween, you can do so, because you know what they look like. It's actually easier, though. Just cut out, like, the letter C 50 times and put it on you, right? And that way, when somebody says, what are you? You can say, I'm a sea person, right? Graduate school, it worked. They won. Yeah. Bad joke, I know, but... So here they are, Shardana, Shekeles, Tejeker, Denyen, Weshesh, Peleset. People have been playing linguistic games with these guys for a very, very long time. So in trying to figure out where they come from, anybody think of anything in the Mediterranean that has consonants like S, R, D, N? Sardinia, absolutely. People have suggested they come from Sardinia. What about Shekeles? Anything with an S and a K and an L, or maybe a C and an L? Sicily. Right, people have suggested Sicily. Tejeker might be somewhere around Troy. Denyen, people want these to be the Danaans of Homer. Agamemnon and those guys. Weshesh, they're not so sure about. Peleset, though, even Jean-Francois Champollion, the guy who deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphics, he had already said the Peleset were Philistines. And in fact, the Bible says the Philistines come from Crete, so maybe that works, maybe it doesn't. So out of all of these, we're not really sure about any except the Peleset. And indeed, some people have said, rather than coming from these areas, they might have gone there after they were defeated. So maybe they gave their name to Sardinia afterward. I happen to think they came from the west and went east because Ramses says he settled them in his strongholds in Egypt and up into Israel, where Tel Dor is called a sickle town, which is one of these guys. So I think that they may well have come from here and then settled over in the east. And one of the reasons I say that is because we know the Philistines from areas of Israel and Lebanon, and their pottery looks like Mycenaean pottery, but made with local clay. It's what we call degenerate Mycenaean. It looks like Mycenaeans from Greece picked up, move over to the Near East, keep making their pottery, but now they're making it with local clay that's not as good. So I think that the Philistines are Mycenaeans, but who have moved to the Near East, and that would fit as part of this.
And the headdress there.
Yeah. Now, notice, though, as part of the inscriptions, Ramses shows us this picture. Here's a drawing of it here. These are not Viking raiders. These are not macho men just out to kill and plunder. These are people moving with their entire families. You see the wives and the kids and the entire household goods on a cart pulled by oxen. This is a mass migration. They are moving because they have to. So I would say this is like the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, people moving from Oklahoma to Texas and California. That's what we're looking at here. So what causes such a migration? You don't move unless you have to. So something is causing it. They have to move. So if it's not the sea peoples, and I think that's too simple, then what is it? But people used to say, oh, there was a drought, then there was famine, then the sea peoples moved, and then they cut the trade routes, and then there was collapse. But, you know, I think things are usually much more complicated. That may have been part of it, but that wasn't the whole thing. So what really happened? That's what we want to spend the rest of the time on. Let's see, we're at, yeah, we've got time. So if the sea peoples are not the bogeyman they used to be, then what might have happened? People have suggested drought, they've suggested famine, they've suggested invaders, they've suggested earthquakes. Which of these do I like? I like them all. I think everything happened. I think this was not a good time to be alive. I think this was a perfect storm of the absolute worst catastrophes all coming at the same time. Because you can survive a drought, at least some people can. You can survive a famine, some people will. Invaders, some people will survive. Earthquakes, some will survive. What if they come one after the other, one on top of another? You get a multiplier effect, and after like the third one, you're like, all right, I give up, we're dead. Right? So I think what we've got is a perfect storm here. Let me show you what I mean. Drought. This is actually not a new suggestion. Rhys Carpenter from Bryn Mawr suggested it in the 1960s. He said the Mycenaeans ended because of drought, but he didn't have proof for it. It was just a hypothesis. Now we've got the proof. In the last 5 years, the proof has come up. There is a site near Ugarit called Gibala, and Kaniuski, a French scholar, led a team there that looked at cores from dried up lakes. And in the cores, they looked at the pollen. And the pollen is showing that there was what he calls a dry event. In other words, a drought. That lasted for about 300 years, from the late 13th, early 12th centuries, right down to the 9th century. In other words, the Dark Ages in Greece. This is that period. So he has evidence that the pollen suggests drier climatic changes and conditions. Went over to Cyprus, did the same thing, 2013 at Hala Sultan Teki, in the dried up lagoon there. Same thing. Major environmental changes from 1200 to 850 BC, everything became drier. So drought, climate change, if you will, caused by Mother Nature. They're not driving SUVs back then, right? But Mother Nature can do it just as well. And then Lee Drake, 2012, looked at stuff from Israel to Turkey to Greece to Italy, came up with at least 3 different other things that all suggest a drier climate, including a drop in the temperature of the surface of the sea. If that happens, you're going to get less rain on the mainland. So maybe we do have a drought after all. And he says this starts between 1250 and 1197 BC. Right? In this particular case, just a word of warning too. Any of you active on Facebook? Any of your students active on Facebook? Right. I liked Lee's article so much that I wanted to send him a little note saying, I don't usually do that, but I'm like, this was a great article in the Journal of Archaeological Science. So I Googled Brandon Lee Drake, and it came up, it says, you are friends on Facebook. I'm like, really? So I sent him an email, and I'm like, I don't actually remember knowing you, but I really liked your article. And he wrote back, he said, Eric, we dug at Megiddo in 2006. I'm like, no, that was a guy named Lee Drake. He says, yeah, that's me. He said, I published with Brandon. My middle name's Lee. I go by Lee. I'm like, so a word of warning, you may know people that you don't even think you know. All right. And then in Israel, Finkelstein, Daphne Langut, and Thomas Litt from Germany, they did the same thing in the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. They took coring samples, and the pollen there also indicates a severe drought from 1250 to 1100 BC. So that's a little bit of a shorter period. It's only 150 years. But so now we've got scientific evidence for drought in North Syria, Israel, Cyprus, Greece. I say that's pretty much the Mediterranean, right? So I think we can say that there's drought. Of course, each time one of these publications came out, the media got a hold of it. New York Times, LA Times, National Geographic, Archaeology, New York Post got into it. Of course, they added in globalization for good matter too, right? So everybody got all excited about late Bronze Age and drought and all that. Finally,
Great how you said finally and then.
finally, yes.
I know, I thought.
Nicely recorded. That's my alarm. Don't you all have Indiana Jones as your alarm? Right. So I know I've got about 10 minutes left. So, right. You remember the NASA-funded study that came out a couple years ago that said we were going to decline in a couple of decades? And then it turned out it wasn't NASA-funded and all that? Right. At that point, I wrote an op-ed for the Huffington Post going, collapse of civilizations, it's complicated, because it is indeed complicated. So, drought equals famine, often. Sure, do we have any evidence for that? Well, that's where Ugarit comes in, and those archives I mentioned, because even if there's famine, we don't have like mass graves at this time. But what we do have is textual evidence. Here is one text from the house of a merchant called Ortenu, which is from about 1185 BC. And he says, there's famine in our house. We'll all die of hunger if you don't quickly arrive here. We ourselves will die of hunger. You will not see a living soul from your land. So, famine? I think so. But others. Here's a letter from the king of Ugarit to somebody else. Here with me, plenty has become famine. So I don't think the texts lie here. These guys are suffering. Even up from the Hittites in Turkey, here's from the king. Do you not know there was a famine in the midst of my land? It's a matter of life and death. All right, so they've got drought and they've got famine. Not too surprising, the two usually go hand in hand. What about invaders and what about internal rebellion? It can be very difficult to tell these apart because you end up with simply a destruction level and you don't often know who did it. So in one case, we know that the king of Ugarit is writing to the king of Cyprus, and he says, my father, now the ships of the enemy have come. They've been setting fire to my cities and have done harm to my land. Now if any other ships come, please let me know. So in this case, we know that this is foreign invaders. And in fact, this text, I was always taught when I was in college and grad school that this was in a kiln in the palace at Ugarit being baked before it was sent to Cyprus, but that the invaders had come and set fire to the city before it could be sent. A very dramatic tale, too good to be true. Turns out upon reanalysis that this was not in a kiln, it was in a basket that had fallen from the second floor and turned upside down, leaving a kiln shape when the basket disintegrated. And it's in there with about 70 other tablets. So we still do know that there are invaders, but we don't know if it's from the last days or maybe from that first wave back in 1207. But still, here we know we've got invaders. And another one from Ugarit. This one we know is from the last days. When your messenger arrived, the army was already humiliated, the city was sacked, our food on the threshing floors was burnt, the vineyards were also destroyed, our city is sacked, may you know it. May you know it. So again, definite invaders here. Same thing with Kaniuski when he was at Gibala. They actually had a destruction layer, which he promptly said is the sea peoples. And the rest of us promptly said, maybe not. It's a destruction, but what says sea peoples? He's like, well, that's when they were here. Like, yeah, but that doesn't mean this is them. So yes, no. I give you Hatzor as probably the best example. Canaanite Hatzor in modern Israel. We know it's destroyed in about 1200 BC because we've got the burnt mud bricks. They're fired red and black in a final destruction. The two co-directors are split, though, as to who did it. One, Amnon ben Tor, says it wasn't Egyptians because there are Egyptian statues that are mutilated in the destruction, and Egyptians would never have mutilated such statues. It's not Canaanites because, same thing, there are Canaanite mutilated statues. They wouldn't have done it. So maybe Israelites, maybe sea peoples. He says this is too far inland for sea peoples, which I disagree with. So for him, that leaves Israelites, which means you get to do the Bible, because Hatzor is mentioned as destroyed in the Bible. So he wants it to be Israelites. But his co-director, Sharon Zuckerman, who just passed away about a year ago, she said, Amnon, wait a minute, what is burnt at our site? And he says, palaces, temples. And she's like, yeah, what else? And he says, no, that's it, palaces and temples. And she's like, well, if you have an internal rebellion, if you're 99% rise up against the 1%, they're going to burn the temples and the palaces, but not their own houses, not their own workshops. And he's like, what are you saying? She says, I think it's an internal rebellion. I think when they have a famine and a drought, they rise up. You can't tell. So if the two co-directors of the site can't decide who destroyed their site, I don't know how we're going to decide. So maybe invaders, maybe internal rebellion, but maybe earthquakes. I'm going to go through this quickly, but let me just say that it's very tough to tell a destruction caused by an earthquake from a destruction caused by humans. The one major difference is you won't have weapons if it's an earthquake. Right? So, for example, there's all the earthquakes that have happened in Turkey in the last 100 years. And if you put them on top of the cities that are destroyed at 1200, you notice most of the cities are in an active seismic fault zone. So in fact, there's all the fault lines, and they're running across our entire area. So I think some of the destructions are caused by earthquakes rather than by humans. So remember that slip zone I showed you at Mycenae? Mycenae is destroyed by an earthquake right at about this time period. At nearby Tiryns, so actually this is still Mycenae, this young woman, you see that rock there? That was in her head. She had sheltered in place. She had sheltered in a doorway, which is usually the safest place in an earthquake. In this case, the doorway came down, slammed in her head, killed her instantly. So that is a Mycenae victim. At nearby Tiryns, which is just about 10 kilometers away, we've got the bones of a woman and child that were killed by a collapsing wall. Troy, that's not supposed to look like that. That's what happens when you have an earthquake. Here's my picture from last August. Right? That is what happens when an earthquake tilts. And indeed, Troy 6 looks like it's destroyed by an earthquake. And then back at Ugarit with all of our tablets, that wall is not supposed to look like that. That's what happens when you have an earthquake. So there are a series of earthquakes that happen between about 1225 and 1175. And then cutting of the trade routes, we've already talked about. If your tin and your copper, if that's cut off at any point, you're in real trouble. And in fact, that may have been why they went to, it's probably why they went to iron afterward. If you can't get the tin, you can't make bronze, you're going to go to iron. And it turns out that iron's actually better anyway. But be aware, they've already been using iron in the Bronze Age, and they still use bronze in the Iron Age. In fact, King Tut's, one of his daggers, you read about that a couple weeks ago, where it said King Tut has an alien dagger. Yeah, the iron's from a meteor, but still, so they did know iron back then. So I think we've got cutting of the trade routes back then also. So if I can sum up then, let me give you 3 points that I think you will all agree with. There'll be no argument. Would you agree that there are a number of separate civilizations at this time? Mycenaeans, Assyrians, Babylonians, Hittites, all that? Right. They are independent, but they're interacting, right? Pretty obvious. Everybody agrees? All right. It's also clear that many of the cities, the ones we've talked about, and others were destroyed at this time, and they come to an end around about 1177. Again, no disagreement, right? Everything goes kaput. Right. But we have no proof as to what caused this. We still don't know the answer, right? Everybody agrees with that. So what are we going to do? Here I've been talking for an hour or so, and I don't have a promised answer, which everybody who reads my book, they get pissed off about that too. I'm like, I don't have an answer because there isn't an answer, because it's still a question that we're investigating. So all of these, I think, are a possibility. However, people still use this simplistic drought to famine to movement of sea peoples to cutting of trade routes to collapse. I heard that at our academic conference last November. I'm like, no, it's not that serious, that simple. It's much, much messier. So what I think we've got, droughts, famine, earthquakes, invaders, rebellions, yes, all of them. It is all together, as I said. And we are so interlinked back then. They are so interdependent, they are not self-sufficient, that when one went down, they all went down, just like dominoes. So when the Mycenaeans go down, it affects the Hittites, which affects the Cypriots, which affects the Egyptians. So this is part of the problem with being so intertwined back then. But it's also what we call a systems collapse. Literally, the entire system collapsed. It's not the only place, it's not the only time this happens elsewhere and elsewhen. But the hallmarks: central administration collapses, traditional elite go away, centralized economy collapses, and you have population shifts and population decline. And again, we see this in other places and in other time periods. It also takes up to a century for this to all happen. So while I used 1177 as kind of the linchpin or the hallmark, I'm fully aware that it didn't all happen that year. It takes, like I said, up to a century. So at one part in the book, I said something like life in 1200 was different from life in 1100 and very different from life in 1000 BC. And that was when my publisher said, that's too long a title, it won't fit on the cover. Seriously, what I would say is 1177 is to the fall of the Bronze Age as 476 is to the fall of the Roman Empire. We all know the Roman Empire did not fall in 476, but that's the date that you drum into the students. If you remember any date, remember 476. Same thing here. I want to make 1177 the date that people remember for the end of the late Bronze Age. But the other takeaway is, what can we learn from this? And I already kind of hinted at this. Are we currently facing a similar situation? Do we have climate change? Well, most would argue yes. We could argue about that for the rest of the afternoon, but most would say yes. Famines and drought, various parts of the world, yes. Earthquakes, rebellions. I think the only thing we're missing are the sea peoples. And in fact, I would now argue that ISIS are the sea peoples, because they are busy destroying all the ancient antiquities and all that. On the other hand, you could say that the refugees in Europe are the sea peoples. Yeah, so it depends. Are they the victims or the oppressors?
Whether it's the Central American refugees coming north or whether it's the, yeah.
Absolutely, right. So I actually think we've got all the same things. And in fact, recent news ripped from the headlines. In the last, like 2-3 years from the Middle East and the Mediterranean, Greece's economy is tanked. There's internal rebellions in Libya, Egypt, and Syria, outsiders and foreign warriors. Turkey is afraid it's going to become involved. Israel's afraid of that. Jordan's crowded with refugees today. Iran, bellicose and threatening. Iraq is in turmoil. If we had headlines from the Middle East from 1200 BC, pretty much the same thing. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? I mostly look at ancient history. I don't look ahead, so I leave it to other people to figure it out. But what I would say is one of the main differences is that we've got obviously better technology now, but we're also aware of what's happening. So when the Hittites had a drought, they probably didn't even realize it for quite a while, and then they couldn't figure out what to do about it. You know, pray to the storm god or something. Now we can figure out what to do about it. The thing is, we have to actually first admit that we've got a problem. And it's kind of the thing where I think if you think you've got a problem and you go to solve it and it turns out you didn't have a problem, what have you lost? But if you did have a problem, then you've gone some way to fixing it. So part of me thinks that we've got some of the same problems that they had back in 1200. I'm optimistic until I realize that every civilization up until now has fallen. And there's no reason why we would be left out of that. So it may be a matter of when rather than if. But I don't think we're quite there yet. At the same time, looking at what happened at 1200 BC does give me pause. And with that, I thank you.